Chimpanzees don't have chins. Yes, they have a bottom jaw, but if we really define what a chin is, it's actually this forward-pointed part that extends out of your lower jaw. And if we compare our skulls to chimp skulls, we can see that theirs point backwards, not forwards. In fact, humans are the only species in the whole animal kingdom that have chins like this. So what gives? What possible purpose could a chin serve? Well, scientists are still pretty unsure, but I'm sure even you could think of some reasonable ideas. Maybe the way we chew is different to other animals, and the chin was needed to reinforce those stresses. Or maybe our use of language put extra forces on our jaws, and the chin is needed to allow our tongues to move in different ways. Or maybe our ancestors just found chins really attractive, and people with these weird protrusions out their bottom of their skulls managed to have more babies and pass on their chin genes.
Whatever the reason, we can at least say that there must be some function for the chin, right? Right. This kind of thinking is known as adaptationism, and it's the idea that if I look at any trait in biology, I should be able to explain why it's there using natural selection alone. So all traits should have clear functions and everything should give a clear advantage to the organism. Otherwise, why would they have evolved in the first place? So brains are for thinking, hands are for holding things, and chins, well, they must have some function or other. This philosophy of evolution remained relatively dominant in the first half of the 20th century. But during the 60s and 70s, adaptationism was placed on the chopping block during two of the biggest debates that are still going on in biology today.
In 1968, Japanese geneticist Moto Kimura proposed a completely new way of looking at biology, known as the neutral theory of molecular evolution. Kimura claimed that beneficial mutations only constitute a minuscule proportion of our genome, whilst the vast majority is there by pure random chance, not natural selection. How could this possibly be?
Here I've got a population of blob creatures. They're not as nice as primers blobs, but they'll do for now. To see how random chance can influence evolution, each year I'll spin this wheel and randomly eliminate one half of the population. For those unlucky ones, they'll end up going to blob heaven, whilst the remaining ones will get the chance to reproduce exactly once. So basically the population doubles. For this case, it's not that interesting because we're only left with red blobs, but we'll play it out anyway. And so what will happen in the next year is that all the blobs will get randomized by getting shuffled into this shuffler. And I'll pull them out randomly, and we'll spin the wheel again for the next year and repeat the process. Once we end up with only one colour in the population, we can stop the simulation because no amount of randomization is going to change what occurs. But if we restart and run a few more simulations, we can see if the blues can manage to win. Now, imagine if a biologist came and looked at this population. They might think that there is some advantage to being a blue blob because they're the only ones present in the population. But because we were there, we know that's not true at all, and blue just got lucky. But this raises an important point, that just because everyone in the population has a mutation, doesn't mean that it has to confer an advantage to the organism. This whole process of random evolution is called genetic drift, and it is the cornerstone of Kimura's theory. Genetic drift is nothing new. It's been well documented with mathematics since the 1930s, but most people considered it much less significant than natural selection. In Kimura's theory though, he says that we've gotten it all backwards, and that genetic drift is the main driver of genetic variation, not natural selection. Why would he think that random chance played such a huge role in biology? It's very counterintuitive. To answer that, we'll have to look at the genome itself. Often our DNA is described like a recipe for a dish, and that metaphor is not too far from reality. In this case, the ingredients, so for my peanut butter sandwich, the only ingredients are the peanut butter and the bread. They're our amino acids, and the very straightforward recipe is the DNA. Once the cell puts all that together to make a finished sandwich, that is the protein. And ultimately, making proteins is the main goal of the cell. It's to turn the information encoded in your DNA using the amino acids and putting them in the correct order to form a finished protein. But the strange thing is only 2% of our genome has these instructions. The remaining 98% does some form of other things, but a lot of it is non-functional. Depending on which biochemist you'll ask, you'll get different answers for how useful the other 98% of our genome is. But let's say about an additional 10% is used for regulating other processes in the cell. That still leaves a huge chunk of our DNA as non-functional. What this means for neutral theory is that when mutations occur in this non-functional part of the genome, it has no effect on the cell because that DNA has no function. So any mutations that occur aren't going to have an effect at all. So these mutations are invisible to natural selection and therefore only under the control of genetic drift. Okay, but what about mutations that occur in the functional part of our genome? Well, pretty much all biologists agree that if we just start swapping out, say, bread for newspaper, or the equivalent, if we start randomly changing parts of our DNA, it's not going to end very well, and most mutations are going to be deleterious. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to eat a newspaper and peanut butter sandwich. So natural selection quickly weeds out all of these mutations and they go in the bin. The next possibility is that we have a mutation, say we're switching out our peanut butter, but the mutation doesn't really change too much, like say substituting peanut butter for Nutella. It still makes a decent sandwich, but ultimately the consequences aren't too big of a deal either way. These are known as neutral mutations, and according to Kimura's neutral theory, these are the next most common mutations after the deleterious ones. Finally, it's also possible that a truly advantageous mutation does come along. So say we go back to our peanut butter sandwich, but instead of having just peanut butter, a mutation comes along that we can add in peanut butter and jam. And these is clearly a superior combination. But according to neutral theory, these mutations are incredibly rare. And that also makes sense because if we just start randomly substituting things, it's going to be very rare that we happen to come across this combination of peanut butter and jam. It's just more likely that we're probably going to get newspaper or, I don't know, some other random stuff for bread instead of something actually beneficial. So adding all of this up, it means that most mutations, if they occur in the non-functional part, are neutral. And then the next most common are going to be deleterious mutations in the functional part of our genome, but they ended up all in the bin because of natural selection, and beneficial ones are just unlikely. That leaves that almost all mutations that get fixed in our genome are neutral. But because these neutral mutations don't have an effect on reproductive output, they're not under the influence of natural selection at all. This leaves genetic drift and random chance to influence how these mutations come about into our genome. And that's Kimura's theory.
As soon as Kimura proposed his theory, it generated huge controversy and split the biological world into two camps. On one side were the neutralists, who agreed on the importance of genetic drift. On the other were the selectionists, who opposed neutral theory and claimed that natural selection was the more important driver of molecular evolution. And today, biologists are still throwing rocks at each other about it. Despite that, neutral theory has now become central to the study of evolutionary biology because it provides a useful null hypothesis. That is, mutations of interest are often presumed to be neutral, the product of genetic drift alone, until proven otherwise. During the 70s, natural selection still managed to hold its ground at the macroscopic level, even as the neutralist-selectionist debate was at its peak. Everyone agreed that adaptations like camouflage or the long necks of giraffes were the product of natural selection. This was fine because Kimura's theory only cared about genetic variation at the level of molecules, not macroscopic traits. But in 1979, another revolutionary paper was published that cast doubt towards the ubiquity of natural selection, even at the level of traits.
This is Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin's paper, The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm. Now, for most people, that title's just complete gibberish, but if we unpack it, we can actually understand most of what Gould and Lewontin were saying. And to do that, we'll need to start in 18th century Europe with German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz was deeply troubled by the problem of evil, which is the question of how to reconcile an all-knowing, all-powerful, and omnibenevolent God with the existence of evil and suffering in our world. And to come up with a solution to the problem, he conducted a little thought experiment. Imagine that you are God, and since you're all-powerful, you can create any world that you want. Now, you have the option to create the one that we got here, Or you could potentially create a really nice utopia that has less war, less pandemic, less suffering. Or you could be really nasty and create an even worse world, which has more famine, more war, and less plants, less water, whatever, more volcanoes. Now, obviously these two are not going to be created by an omnibenevolent God, so that kind of explains why we got this one and not these two. But the big question is, why not create a nice utopia for us? And Leibniz concludes that there must be something wrong with these two worlds, else God would have created them. Maybe with slightly fewer wars or slightly less suffering, the laws of physics would have changed somehow and these worlds would have just blown up. So we can knock those two out, which means we're left with our world as the best of all possible worlds. Now, the conclusions of Leibniz's philosophy are pretty strange, because if we live in the best of all possible worlds, that means that all wars, all suffering is for the best, because no other world is possible.
Few people have taken Leibniz's philosophy to heart. Such extreme optimism is especially hard to digest when we're faced with tragedy. And in the 18th century, there was no shortage of tragedy, with the 7 Years' War and the Lisbon earthquake, which killed 20% of the city's population. In the wake of these events, many people turned on Leibniz and began to doubt that they really were living in the best of all possible worlds. One such person was the French writer Voltaire, who wrote the satirical novella Candide to ridicule Leibniz. In Candide, Voltaire constructs the character of Dr. Pangloss, who is a Leibnizian optimist and Candide's philosophical mentor. Pangloss, of course, tells Candide that they live in the best of all possible worlds.
Since everything was made for a purpose, it follows...
That everything was made for the best purpose.
Correct. Noses were made...
Noses were made to keep our spectacles on.
So we wear spectacles.
Of course, Dr. Pangloss is meant to be taken as a joke character, someone that we just laugh at. But Gould and Lewontin argue that we haven't been laughing at Pangloss at all, but evolutionary biologists have actually taken his optimism to heart in what they call the Panglossian paradigm. In this paradigm, biologists assume that any trait that we observe must be there because of natural selection, and therefore optimized for
The best purpose.
Correct.
This was actually our thought process at the start of the video, where we assumed that the chin had to have a function. But maybe the chin has no function at all and is just there because of genetic drift. Although genetic drift does work a little bit differently for traits because every trait is controlled by multiple genes, but that's another story. The point being that if we lock ourselves into this Panglossian paradigm, we can ignore other non-adaptive possibilities for the existence of a trait.
To see how adaptive storytelling can lead biologists astray, imagine if a Panglossian alien biologist came down to Earth and observed that lots of animals have 4 limbs. Most mammals have 2 arms and 2 legs, unless you're a whale. So do most reptiles, unless you're a snake. And so do birds, who have 2 legs and 2 flappy arms. As any good Panglossian, you assume that 4 must be some kind of golden number for these species, much better than 3 or 5. All of this, of course, misses the bigger picture, that we all have 2 arms and 2 legs, not because of some adaptation, but because our common ancestor also happened to have 2 arms and 2 legs, and this is just a constraint that evolution had to work with. Today, because of Gould and Lewontin, few biologists make this error with adaptive storytelling anymore, and the broader evolutionary history of organisms is almost always taken into account via the field of phylogenetics. But this doesn't help us with our chin problem, because we're the only species that has them. There's no comparable history available to study by looking elsewhere in the tree of life. So do we have to revert back to adaptationism? Not quite, and this is where the other part of their cryptic title comes into play.
Here I have a photo inside St. Mark's Basilica, which is the San Marco referenced in Gould and Lewontin's paper. Why bother mentioning a church in a biology paper? Well, it starts with these triangly bits, which are located just underneath the dome. The architectural term for a triangly bit between a dome and an arch is known as a spandrel. Inside them is lots of beautiful iconography, and if we didn't know any better, we might think that this is the initial inspiration for the design of the arches and the dome. But all of this misses the bigger picture, that if we have any building with 4 arches, like this, and a dome on top, we end up with spandrels by default. They're just a result of the architectural constraints of the building. And once we have these triangly bits, they provide a nice canvas, which we can put nice iconography on top. But these are no means the start of the design. Accordingly, we can think of spandrels as the byproducts of design elsewhere.
Moving back to biology, Gould and Lewontin argued that our chin too could be a spandrel. They argued that as we began to cook our food, we no longer needed such big teeth to chew everything down. Natural selection therefore favoured the shrinking of our teeth and this part of the mouth, revealing the chin as a byproduct. So, if this hypothesis is true, our chin has no function at all and is not an adaptation. The validity of this teeth shrinking hypothesis is still being researched today, but the main takeaway was the broader possibility of spandrels in biology, which are now of significant enough interest to biologists to warrant their own Wikipedia page. Biological spandrels have been proposed all over the tree of life, but another interesting case lies inside pandas. If you look closely at a panda's hand, you'll notice that it actually has 6 digits, the 5 regular ones plus a thumb. The thing with their thumb is that it's actually fake, an outgrowth of one of its wrist bones. And the strangest thing is that the panda's foot has a very similar outgrowth of the same corresponding bone, just not as large. Now, one hypothesis would be that this outgrowth is also some kind of adaptation, maybe better for kicking off predators or something. Wait, 4 fingers? Really? But Gould highlights that it is much more likely that the enlargement is a spandrel, as both bones are probably under the control of the same genes. Enlargement in the hand, for grabbing bamboo, indirectly creates an enlargement in the foot, a spandrel.
A few moments later.
The aftermath of the spandrels paper was pretty catastrophic. The situation among biologists became so bad that adaptation became a dirty word. In the early 80s, a speaker even said that he would use the word banana when he meant adaptation, to avoid controversy.
Boo!
Some have advocated for analysing the importance of natural selection across all of biology through what they call the Adaptationism project. Obviously, this is pretty ambitious, with there being an uncountably large number of traits in biology, and each trait alone would require months, if not years of work with mathematical modelling and analysis to work out if it was an adaptation or not. Needless to say, such a project has not really taken off.
Others held on to adaptationism in a more positive light and conceded that although natural selection might only explain a minuscule portion of the natural world that we see, it is this portion that ultimately matters. Philosopher Daniel Dennett believes that adaptationist thinking is completely non-optional and that if we did away with it, all of biology would come crashing down. This seems like a pretty extreme position to have, but it does raise the big meta question. What questions should we even be interested in as evolutionary biologists? Should we always be working to understand adaptation? According to Lewontin, the answer is in fact no. 4 years after the publication of Spandrels, Lewontin argued that biology had now outgrown the adaptationist approach, and that we needed some new framework to conceptualize biology. To see why, he writes,
The word adaptation implies that the organism is moulded and shaped to fit a pre-existent niche, given by the autonomous forces of the environment, just as a key is cut and filed to fit into a lock. The environment poses problems as selection pressures, and natural selection provides the solutions via adaptations. Lewontin points out that the problem with this approach is that it ignores the role that the organism itself plays in the construction of its own environment. Take the teeth-shrinking spandrel hypothesis for our chin from before. In this case, it's pretty obvious that cooked food only exists as a selection pressure because, well, we started cooking food. We came up with our own problem to solve. A non-human example would be beavers and their dams. Sure, beavers have strong front teeth to cut down trees, but this isn't just an adaptation to an arbitrary problem posed by their environment. They created the problem of dam building themselves. Lewontin describes this as organisms being the objects of natural selection, as well as the subjects that create the conditions for that selection to occur. This phenomenon is now known as niche construction. The whole concept of interaction between organism and environment fits in very nicely with our discussion of continuous individuality from the last video. Lewontin sums it up quite poetically in a single sentence. Just as there is no organism without an environment, there is no environment without an organism. Lewontin's ideas are a centerpiece of the emerging framework of biology known as the extended evolutionary synthesis, which aims to move past pretty much everything we've discussed in this video. Rather than arguing about drift versus selection and spandrels versus adaptations, why not look at all of these other things that play a role in biology? Natural selection is just one piece of that puzzle, albeit an important one. And with this big picture view, we can be more open-minded to the fact that adaptations might not even be that significant in the long run. But until the extended synthesis gets fully developed, we should at least think of organism and environment not as lock and key, but active players that influence each other in the beautiful dance we call life.
Thanks so much for watching. These videos take ages to research, so if you're interested in adaptationism or spandrels or anything else, there's a big long list of sources in the description below. I'll see you in the next one.